What would you do if the very person sworn to protect you turned into your worst nightmare? Imagine an elderly black woman, calm, kind, and unassuming, suddenly punched in broad daylight by a racist cop. But here's the twist. She's no ordinary woman. She's an undercover FBI agent, and what happens next will leave you speechless. Keep watching to see how justice takes an unexpected turn. If you love stories that expose the truth and teach powerful life lessons, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to Life Story, and turn on notifications so you never miss another jaw-dropping tale. Let's dive into this unforgettable journey. In the small, tightly knit town of Kingston Falls, Officer Barnett was a name whispered with both fear and disdain. Known for his brash arrogance and unchecked authority, Barnett had built a reputation for targeting minorities, and his latest victim was no exception. Under the orange glow of the setting sun, Ephraim, a young black man on his way home from work, found himself at the wrong place at the wrong time, or so it seemed. Sirens blared behind him, red and blue lights painting the street in a chaotic dance. Ephraim's car rolled to a stop, and with a shaky breath, he lowered his window. Barnett approached with heavy boots and an air of superiority. His voice was sharp as he demanded Ephraim's license, then accused him of speeding, despite no evidence. The young man complied, hands trembling, but compliance wasn't enough. Barnett's interrogation escalated, his voice dripping with condescension. Ephraim's calm explanations were met with jeers. As the situation spiraled, Ephraim's mother, Claudet, arrived, rushing to the scene after a passerby called her. Her voice, firm but pleading, cut through the tension like a knife. "Officer, my son hasn't done anything wrong. Please, just let him go." But Barnett didn't care. Her pleas fell on deaf ears as he shoved Ephraim against his car, handcuffs clicking loudly. Claudet's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "One day, you'll answer for this." Barnett smirked, unbothered. Little did he know her words were not an empty threat. The next morning, a bus rolled into town, carrying an elderly woman with an air of quiet strength. This was Claudet, Ephraim's mother, yes, but far more than that. A retired school teacher and lifelong advocate for justice, she wasn't the type to stand idly by. She had come to Kingston Falls with another purpose, to visit her niece, Thalassa, a spirited young woman studying law at the local university. Claudet's presence was immediately felt. With sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, she noticed the strained smiles of the townspeople, the way certain individuals crossed the street to avoid others, and the heavy weight of silence in spaces where there should have been laughter. At the university campus, Claudet greeted Thalassa warmly, the two embracing as though they hadn't seen each other in years. "How's the studying coming along, Thalassa?" Claudet asked with a knowing smile. "It's tough, Auntie, but it's worth it. I want to make a difference, just like you always told me." Claudet's smile deepened. She had always believed in the power of education and persistence to create change. But something about this town, its simmering tensions and unspoken rules, told her it would take more than just education to make things right. Later that evening, Claudet and Thalassa went to a local diner for dinner. The place was bustling with chatter, the scent of coffee and fried food filling the air. But not everything was as warm as it seemed. At the counter, a young black waitress fumbled with an order, her hands visibly shaking as Officer Barnett loomed over her. His voice was sharp and belittling. "Is it that hard to get an order right? Or are you just too distracted to care?" The waitress stammered an apology, but Barnett wasn't satisfied. He leaned closer, his tone dripping with mockery. That's when Claudet intervened. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "She's doing her best. Maybe a little patience wouldn't hurt." Barnett turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" Claudet met his glare with unwavering composure. "Just someone who believes in treating people with respect." The diner fell silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Barnett chuckled, a cold sound that sent a shiver through the room. "You'd better watch yourself, lady," he said, his tone low and threatening. "I'll be keeping an eye on you." As Barnett stormed out, the atmosphere in the diner remained tense. Claudet calmly returned to her seat, but Thalassa was visibly shaken. "Auntie, you didn't have to do that." Claudet smiled softly. Sometimes you have to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable. But in her heart, she knew this was just the beginning. Later that night, Claudet decided to take a walk to clear her mind. The air was cool and the streets were quiet. As she walked, her thoughts wandered to Ephraim and the injustice he had faced. She resolved to take action, but her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps behind her. She turned and found herself face to face with Officer Barnett. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice laced with hostility. "Just taking a walk," Claudet replied evenly. Barnett stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "I don't believe I am," Claudet said, standing her ground. But Barnett didn't want to hear it. His anger flared, and within moments the situation escalated. Words turned into shouts, and before Claudet could react, Barnett's fist connected with her jaw, sending her to the ground. Claudet lay there, dazed but defiant. As she struggled to her feet, she fixed Barnett with a piercing gaze. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. Barnett laughed as he walked away, leaving her on the ground. But this time, Claudet wasn't just a victim. She was a storm waiting to strike. The morning after the incident, Officer Barnett swaggered into the station, the usual smirk plastered across his face. He was in high spirits, recounting his encounter with Claudet to a small group of officers gathered near the break room. "You should have seen her face," he sneered. "Tried to tell me what to do, like she was somebody important. I showed her who's in charge around here." His laughter echoed, and a few of his colleagues joined in, though some only offered half-hearted chuckles, clearly uncomfortable. Leander, a younger officer with a strong moral compass, stayed silent, his jaw tightening as Barnett continued to gloat. Finally, he couldn't hold back. "Barnett," Leander said, his tone firm but cautious, "you might want to be careful who you mess with. You don't know everyone's story." Barnett turned to him, eyebrows raised in mock amusement. "Oh, come on, Leander. Don't tell me you're buying into that righteous nonsense. She's just some old woman who needed to be put in her place." Leander's gaze didn't waver. "You've got a habit of going too far, Barnett. One day, it's going to come back to bite you." Barnett waved him off dismissively, grabbing his coffee and heading for his desk. "Relax, kid. Nobody's going to care about some old lady. This is my town, remember?" But as Leander watched Barnett walk away, a nagging feeling told him this time was different. The next day began like any other at the Kingston Falls Police Department. Officers milled about, sipping coffee and filing reports, the hum of activity filling the air. But the routine was shattered when a sleek black SUV pulled up outside the station, its tinted windows gleaming under the morning sun. Two figures stepped out, a tall, sharp-dressed woman with piercing eyes and an air of authority, and a broad-shouldered man whose silent demeanor spoke volumes. Agents Lysandra and Gideon moved with purpose, their presence commanding immediate attention as they entered the building. "We're here to speak with Officer Barnett," Lysandra announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. Barnett, who had been leaning back in his chair, lazily spinning a pen between his fingers, perked up at the sound of his name. He sauntered toward them, clearly unimpressed. "And who might you be?" he asked, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. Lysandra pulled out her badge, flashing it with a precision that made Barnett's grin falter for a split second. "FBI. We need to ask you a few questions about an incident involving an undercover agent." Barnett's confidence returned quickly, and he laughed, crossing his arms. "Undercover agent? In Kingston Falls? Lady, I think you've got the wrong guy." But Lysandra wasn't amused. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a cool, controlled tone. "Oh, we're very sure we have the right guy. Yesterday, you assaulted an elderly woman. That woman happens to be one of ours, Special Agent Claudet, currently investigating corruption in small-town law enforcement." The room fell silent. Barnett's smirk vanished as the weight of her words sank in. "Wait, what?" he stammered, his bravado cracking. Gideon, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his deep voice carrying an edge of warning. "You didn't just hit an innocent woman. You attacked an FBI agent. Do you understand the severity of that, Officer Barnett?" Barnett's face flushed, his mind racing. He struggled to maintain his composure, but his usual arrogance betrayed him. "Look, I didn't know who she was. She shouldn't have been out there at night." "Save it. Lysandra interrupted sharply. Excuses won't help you now. You're suspended from duty effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Barnett's colleagues watched in stunned silence as Lysandra handed him an official notice, her movements swift and efficient. You can either cooperate with the investigation, Gideon added, his tone leaving no room for argument, or we can take this to the next level. Trust me, you don't want that. Barnett's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless, and the realization hit him like a freight train. As the agents turned to leave, Lysandra glanced back over her shoulder. You might want to think about hiring a good lawyer. You're going to need one. Barnett stood frozen, his colleagues whispering around him. Leander, who had been watching from a distance, shook his head, muttering under his breath, I warned you, Barnett. Outside, Claudet sat in the SUV, her expression calm but resolute. From her position, she could see Barnett through the station's glass doors. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, a flicker of fear crossing his face. Claudet smiled faintly. This was just the beginning. Officer Barnett's suspension didn't go over quietly. The next day, he stormed into his modest home, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. His face was red with rage, and his mind raced with thoughts of betrayal. A setup, he growled, pacing his living room like a caged animal. That's what this is. Some kind of trick to take me down. He grabbed a beer from the fridge, his hand trembling with anger as he took a long swig. Barnett couldn't accept the possibility that he'd gone too far. In his eyes, Claudet wasn't a victim. She was an enemy. At the same time, Claudet was hard at work, her injuries healing, but her determination only growing stronger. Back at her temporary base, she sat at a desk strewn with documents, her laptop open to a secure FBI database. With a few keystrokes, she began unraveling Barnett's career. What she found didn't surprise her, but it fueled her fire. Complaint after complaint, most of them dismissed or buried, painted a picture of a man who had abused his power for years. Racial profiling, excessive force, verbal harassment, the list went on. She paused, looking over a particularly chilling report from a few years back. A young Hispanic man, barely 18, had suffered a fractured rib after a routine traffic stop with Barnett. The case had been quietly closed due to lack of evidence. Not this time, Claudet murmured to herself, her voice resolute. Her investigation didn't stop at official records. She reached out to the local community, speaking to people who had been too afraid to come forward. They shared their stories in hushed tones, their eyes filled with equal parts fear and relief that someone was finally listening. One woman, a middle-aged mother named Evelyn, recalled how Barnett had harassed her teenage son for walking home from school. Another man, a retired veteran, described how Barnett had humiliated him during a routine vehicle check. Claudet listened to each account, taking meticulous notes. With every story, her resolve deepened. Barnett wasn't just a bad cop, he was a symptom of a larger problem, one she was determined to expose. Late one evening, as the town settled into quiet, Claudet sat alone in her temporary office, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Her eyes drifted to an old photograph tucked in the corner of her desk. It was a younger version of herself, smiling in her FBI Academy uniform, surrounded by her classmates. She picked up the photo, her fingers brushing over the edges as memories flooded back. Claudet had grown up in the Deep South during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Her father, a preacher, had taught her the value of standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. But it wasn't an easy path. When she joined the FBI decades ago, she was one of the few black women in her class. The discrimination she faced was relentless, side comments, doubted abilities, and glass ceilings that seemed unbreakable. But Claudet wasn't one to back down. You can't change anything from the sidelines, her father had once told her. You've got to get in the game. And that's exactly what she did. Over the years, Claudet climbed the ranks, earning a reputation for her sharp instincts and unyielding commitment to justice. She handled cases that others wouldn't touch, taking down corrupt officials and exposing systemic issues that had long been ignored. But her success came at a price. The weight of fighting injustice day after day was heavy, and the scars, both literal and emotional, ran deep. Even so, Claudet never lost sight of why she started. Now, staring at the photo, She felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her current mission wasn't just about Barnett. It was about making sure people like him couldn't thrive in a system that should protect everyone equally. "This isn't over," she said softly, setting the photo back down. Her eyes burned with determination. Not by a long shot. Officer Barnett's swagger had all but disappeared. The walls were closing in, and his usual tactics of intimidation and bravado weren't working. Suspension meant he no longer had the shield of his badge, but that didn't stop him from trying to silence those who threatened his crumbling reputation. Late one evening, Ephraim returned home to find Barnett waiting on his porch, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. "We need to talk," Barnett said, his voice low but menacing. Ephraim froze, his hand tightening around the keys in his pocket. "I have nothing to say to you." Barnett stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Listen, kid, you don't want to get involved in all this FBI nonsense. People who talk, they have a way of regretting it." Ephraim's eyes burned with fear and defiance, but before he could respond, his mother, Claudet's ally Evelyn, stepped outside. Her glare could have melted steel. "Leave my son alone," she said firmly, stepping between them. "You've done enough." Barnett sneered, but backed off, muttering, "You've been warned." But he didn't stop there. Later that night, Thalassa received a threatening anonymous text. "Drop the case, or you'll wish you had." She showed it to Claudet the next morning, her hands shaking. "He's trying to scare us." Claudet took the phone, her expression calm but resolute. "He's running out of moves, and he knows it. The more desperate he gets, the more mistakes he'll make." That same day, Claudet confronted Barnett outside a local coffee shop. He was leaning against his car, clearly waiting for someone. "Barnett?" she said, her voice sharp. He turned, startled but quickly recovering his arrogance. "Agent Claudet? Here to gloat?" She stepped closer, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "The deeper you dig, the worse it will be for you. Keep threatening witnesses, and I'll make sure you go down for obstruction on top of everything else." Barnett smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think you can scare me? I've been in this town longer than you've been alive." Claudet didn't flinch. "And yet here we are. Keep digging, Barnett. You'll find yourself buried." Barnett watched her walk away, a gnawing sense of dread taking root in his chest. Determined to end Barnett's reign of terror, Claudet devised a plan. She and her team set up a sting operation, using fabricated evidence of an alleged witness report implicating Barnett in corruption. The bait was simple, a forged document suggesting there were records in the station's archives that could seal Barnett's fate. "He'll go after it," Claudet told her team. "He's desperate enough to try anything." That night, Barnett broke into the police station, his flashlight sweeping across the dark, empty hallways. He moved with purpose, heading straight for the archives room. Unbeknownst to him, the FBI had wired the entire room with hidden cameras and microphones. As Barnett rifled through files, muttering under his breath, his anger boiled over. "This is all her fault. That woman's trying to ruin me." Finally, he found the fake document and tore it apart, his frustration spilling into a full-blown tantrum. "Nobody's going to take me down. Not her, not the FBI, not anyone." The moment he stormed out, Lysandra and Gideon were waiting. "Officer Barnett," Lysandra said, stepping into his path, "we've been watching." Barnett froze, his face draining of color, as Gideon held up a tablet, playing back the footage of his actions. "Congratulations," Gideon said dryly. "You've just added destruction of evidence and breaking and entering to your list of charges." Barnett lunged at them, but Lysandra easily sidestepped him, twisting his arm behind his back. "It's over, Barnett," she said coldly. "You're done." As Barnett sat in an interrogation room, his fury giving way to panic, he realized the situation was worse than he'd imagined. Claudet entered the room, a folder in her hand. "You've been busy," she said, dropping the folder on the table. Photographs spilled out. Images of Barnett meeting with members of a notorious local gang, shaking hands and exchanging envelopes. "What is this?" he demanded, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Claudet leaned forward, her voice a deadly whisper. "It's proof. Proof that you've been colluding with the Black Ridge Gang to cover up their drug operations. You've been protecting them, and in return, they've been lining your pockets." Barnett's eyes darted around the room. "You don't have anything solid," Claudet smirked. "You think so? Funny thing about criminals, they're not very loyal. When we brought in your pals, they couldn't wait to talk. It's amazing what people will confess when they're offered immunity." As if on cue, the door opened, and two of Barnett's former friends were escorted past the interrogation room. One of them glanced at him with a smirk, mouthing, "Sorry, man." Barnett's world crumbled. The people he thought were his allies had betrayed him, leaving him to face the consequences alone. Claudet stood, gathering the photographs and tucking them back into the folder. "I told you, Barnett, the deeper you dig, the worse it will be for you." As she walked out of the room, Barnett slumped in his chair, his arrogance replaced by utter defeat. For the first time in his life, he had no one to blame but himself. Barnett's trial became the talk of the town. The courthouse was packed with spectators, journalists, and community members eager to see justice served. For many, it was the first time they felt hope that the corrupt power structures suffocating their lives might finally change. Claudet sat in the front row, her presence commanding respect and attention. She had done her part, gathered the evidence, rallied the voices of the unheard, and brought light to Barnett's shadowy deeds. Now it was time for the justice system to do its job. Ephraim took the stand first, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted his terrifying encounter with Barnett. "He didn't care that I hadn't done anything wrong," Ephraim said, his voice steadying as he spoke. "He just saw my skin color and decided I was guilty." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Thalassa followed, her testimony sharp and unflinching. She detailed Barnett's threats and intimidation tactics, refusing to let fear silence her. "I stand here today not just for myself," she said, her voice ringing clear, "but for everyone who's been too afraid to stand up to people like him." Finally, it was Claudet's turn. Taking the stand, she laid out the results of her investigation with the precision and authority of a seasoned agent. She didn't just expose Barnett's crimes, she painted a picture of the lives he had shattered along the way. The prosecution's closing arguments were damning, and the defense had little to counter with. When the verdict came, it was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Barnett sat stone-faced as the judge handed down the sentence, decades in prison, ensuring he would never hold a badge again. Not everyone in the department had turned a blind eye to Barnett's behavior. Officer Lander, who had quietly voiced his discomfort with Barnett's actions, found himself at a crossroads. After the trial, he approached Claudet as she gathered her things outside the courthouse. "Agent Claudet," he called, his voice hesitant. She turned, her sharp gaze softening slightly as she recognized him. "Officer Lander, what can I do for you?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I wanted to say I should have done more. I saw what was happening, but I didn't speak up. I thought it wasn't my place." Claudet studied him for a moment before responding. "It's easy to look the other way, especially when the system rewards silence, but recognizing that is the first step toward change." Lander nodded, his resolve hardening. "I want to do better. I want to help rebuild this department into something we can be proud of." Claudet gave him a rare smile. "Then start by listening, to your colleagues, to your community. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you." Lander wasn't the only one inspired. A small group of officers, many of whom had stayed silent out of fear, began working together to reform the department. They reached out to community leaders, implemented new policies, and worked to rebuild trust with the people they served. The day before Barnett's transfer to a federal prison, Claudet received an unexpected message. Barnett wanted to see her. Despite her initial hesitation, she agreed, meeting him in a stark holding room. Barnett looked different, his arrogance replaced with a weary bitterness. "I asked you here because," he began, faltering for the first time. "I wanted to apologize." Claudet raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting him continue. "I didn't realize," he paused, struggling with the weight of his words. "I didn't realize how much damage I'd done. I was angry, and I took it out on people who didn't deserve it." Claudet's expression remained unreadable as she listened. "I'm sorry," Barnett finished, his voice barely a whisper. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I am." Claudet leaned forward, her voice steady and firm. "You don't owe me an apology, Barnett. You owe it to every person you've wronged. The mother who feared for her son's life, the veteran you humiliated, the families you tore apart. That's who you should be apologizing to. Barnett looked away, her words cutting deeper than he expected. Claudet stood, her presence as commanding as ever. You have a long time to think about what you've done. Use it wisely. With that, she walked out, leaving Barnett alone with his thoughts. The sun was setting as Claudet prepared to leave town, her work here done. Ephraim, Thalassa, and a small group of community members gathered to see her off. You changed everything, Ephraim said, his voice filled with gratitude. Claudet smiled gently. No, Ephraim, you did. By standing up and speaking out, you set this in motion. Thalassa stepped forward, her eyes shining with admiration. I don't know if I'll ever be as brave as you, but I'll try. Claudet placed a hand on her shoulder. Bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. And from what I've seen, you have plenty of that. As she climbed into her car, she paused to look back at the group. Justice isn't about revenge, she said. It's about making things right. Don't forget that. With that, she drove off, leaving behind a town forever changed by her unwavering pursuit of justice.